The diagnosis no one wants to hear. Dukkha, the first noble truth. The Buddha didn't start with comfort. He didn't start with a prayer or a promise of paradise or a reassuring hand on your shoulder. He started the way a doctor starts, with a diagnosis. And like every real diagnosis, it was the thing no one in the room wanted to hear. 2,500 years later, most people think they know what he said. Life is suffering. 4 words. Case closed. Buddhism, the pessimistic religion. Except he never said that, not once. What he actually said was more precise, more layered, and far more uncomfortable. Because it wasn't about life. It was about you. Here's what the diagnosis actually looks like. There are 3 layers. The first, you already know. Pain, aging, loss. Every religion gets that far. The second is the one that unsettles people, because it says your happiest moments carry a hidden knife. And the third, the deepest, is the one that separates Buddhism from every other system of thought in human history. But here's what the mistranslation buried for 150 years. This was never meant to be a statement about the universe. It was meant to be a task, not something to believe, something to do. The doctor doesn't describe your illness to depress you. He describes it because he has the treatment, and that changes everything. The misdiagnosis. The lie. So where did life is suffering come from? Not from the Buddha, not from any sutta in the Pali Canon, not from any monk who studied with him or any student who carried his words forward for centuries. It came from Victorian England. In 1881, a British scholar named T.W. Rhys Davids helped found the Pali Text Society in London, the first serious Western attempt to translate the Buddhist scriptures. His team faced a problem that every translator faces, a word with no English equivalent. The word was dukkha. And in the intellectual climate of colonial Britain, where Anglican clergy debated Buddhist monks as public demonstrations of Christian superiority, where Buddhism had already been labelled a religion of world weariness and nihilistic despair, that word got flattened into suffering. The first noble truth became life is suffering, and that translation stuck. For 150 years, it stuck. The axle. Here's what the word actually means. In ancient Pali, dukkha is built from 2 roots, du, bad, and ka, the hole at the center of a wheel where the axle fits. A wheel with a bad axle hole. The cart still moves. It still gets you from one place to another. But every rotation wobbles. Every mile shakes. The ride is never smooth. That's not suffering. That's something harder to name. A fundamental off-ness at the center of experience. Not catastrophe, not agony. A wobble. Now, I should be honest with you. Some scholars argue this etymology is folk tradition, rather than strict linguistics. Monier Williams proposed an alternative route meaning simply standing badly. But whether the axle hole is historical fact or ancient metaphor, it points to something the English word suffering completely misses. Dukkha is not about extreme pain. It's about the subtle friction underneath everything, including what feels good. The translation problem. This matters more than you might think, because the mistranslation didn't just confuse a word, it distorted an entire framework. Listen to how differently scholars hear this single term. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, the American monk who has spent 40 years translating the Pali Canon, renders dukkha as stress. Not dramatic, not existential. Stress, the way an engineer talks about stress on a bridge. Structural, pervasive, often invisible until something cracks. Peter Harvey translates it simply as pain, closer to the raw nerve, less metaphorical. Bhikkhu Bodhi, whose translations are probably the most widely used in academia, prefers suffering, but qualifies it heavily. He knows the word is leaking meaning. The psychoanalyst Mark Epstein uses pervasive unsatisfactoriness. Caroline Rhys Davids, the wife of the man who started the translation problem, tried to fix it a generation later with dis-ease, not disease, dis-ease, the absence of ease. And the scholar-monk Analayo, after decades of careful textual work, concluded that the most honest approach may be to simply not translate it at all. His reasoning cuts to the heart of the problem. Dukkha does two completely different jobs in the suttas. When it describes a feeling, it means unpleasant or painful, the opposite of pleasant. When it describes conditioned existence, it means unsatisfactory, something much deeper, much wider. One English word cannot do both jobs, and forcing it to do both has confused the teaching for over a century. The reframe. So let me restate the first noble truth without the Victorian filter. The Buddha did not say life is suffering. He said, there is dukkha. There is a wobble at the center of the wheel, and that wobble isn't random. It has a structure you can understand, a cause you can identify, and this is the part the pessimism label always conveniently forgets, an end you can reach. That's not a gloomy verdict on existence. That's a medical framework. The doctor says, you have a condition. Here is what it looks like. Here is what drives it. Here is why it can end. Here is how. You don't call a doctor pessimistic for diagnosing your illness accurately. You call him competent. And the Buddha put it exactly in those terms. In a text called the Itivuttaka, he described himself directly, in his own words, as an unsurpassed doctor and surgeon, Iti 100, not a priest, not a prophet, not a philosopher offering opinions about the nature of reality, a doctor delivering a diagnosis. The scholar Walpola Rahula wrote that Buddhism is neither pessimistic nor optimistic. If anything, he said, it is realistic, but even realistic undersells it, because a diagnosis only matters if there's treatment, and this doctor claimed to have one. So, the diagnosis, not life is suffering, something more precise, a three-layered analysis of why experience wobbles, each layer cutting deeper than the last. The first layer, you'll recognize immediately. It's the one every religion, every philosophy, every human being already knows. But here's what the Buddha did that no one else did. He didn't stop there. Layer 1. What everyone knows. Pain, aging, sickness, death, grief, sorrow, despair. You know this layer. You've lived it. You've watched people you love live it. Every religion in history begins here. The recognition that human life involves pain, and no amount of money or status or luck makes you immune. Buddhism calls this dukkha, the suffering of suffering, the most obvious layer, the one no one argues with. And if this were all the Buddha had to say, there would be no Buddhism. Because this isn't insight, this is observation. Any honest person looking at a human life arrives here eventually. So the question is, why did the Buddha begin with what everyone already knows? The doctor's logic. Because a doctor doesn't skip the obvious. A doctor starts with your symptoms, the ones you walked in with, the ones you can already name, and then shows you what those symptoms actually mean. The familiar becomes the doorway to what you didn't see. And even in this first layer, the Buddha included something most people walk right past. Look at the list again. Aging, yes. Sickness, yes. death, of course, but birth. Birth is on the list, the very first item. In the first sermon at the deer park, the Buddha described dukkha as birth, aging, illness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. S or an N, 56.11. Every religion on earth celebrates birth. Buddhism lists it as dukkha. Why? Not because being born is punishment. Not because life is a mistake, that reading collapses into the same pessimism trap. Birth is dukkha because birth is entry. The moment you're born, you have a body that will age. You have attachments that will break. You have a mind that will cling. Birth isn't suffering. Birth is the condition that makes all the other forms of suffering possible. It's the first wobble of the wheel. That's a different kind of statement. Not life is terrible, money. But the moment you begin, the structure is already in motion. The axle is already off center. Fire. And the Buddha found more than one way to say this. There's a sermon, not the famous one at the deer park, but a later one at a place called Gaia Head, where he threw away the medical language entirely and reached for something far more visceral. All is burning, he said. The eye is burning, forms are burning, eye consciousness is burning. Burning with the fire of passion, the fire of aversion, the fire of delusion. SN 35.28. Not a diagnosis, a blaze. He was speaking to 1,000 former fire worshippers, priests who had spent their lives tending sacred flames, and he took their central symbol and turned it inside out. You've been worshipping fire your whole life, he told them. You didn't notice you were already on fire. The scholar Richard Gombrich called this one of the most brilliant acts of rhetorical strategy in ancient literature. The Buddha choosing the language that would land hardest for this specific audience. Now, you may have encountered this sermon before without knowing it. In 1922, T.S. Eliot titled Part 3 of The Wasteland, one of the most influential poems in the English language, the Fire Sermon. He placed it alongside the Confessions of St. Augustine, two traditions, Eastern and Western, both recognizing that human experience burns with wanting. A man sitting on his sofa in Ohio, who studied Eliot in college 40 years ago, may never have known that the phrase came from a Buddhist sutta delivered to fire worshippers on a hilltop in ancient India. That's the kind of connection this channel exists to make. What this layer actually does. But notice what's happening here. Whether the Buddha uses the language of medicine, this lends itself to disease, as one translator puts it, SN 22.59. Or the language of fire, the function is the same. He's not telling you something new. He's telling you something you already know but haven't looked at directly. That's the work of the first layer, not information, confrontation. You know that bodies break. You know that people die. But there's a difference between knowing and comprehending. And that distinction is going to matter enormously when we get to the deer park later in this video. For now, the Buddha takes what every human being already senses and refuses to let you look away. No metaphysical speculation. No promise of heaven to make the pain tolerable. No, everything happens for a reason. Just, this is what is happening. Look at it, and honestly, if you're listening to this and thinking, I already knew all of that, good, you're supposed to. That's the point. The first layer is the ground floor. The entrance the doctor walks you through so you trust his accuracy before he says the thing that will genuinely unsettle you. Because the second layer doesn't talk about your pain, it talks about your joy. Layer 2, the hidden knife. Think about the happiest moment of the last year. Not the biggest, the happiest. The one where even now remembering it produces warmth. Maybe it was an evening, a meal with someone you love, a grandchild's voice on the phone, a morning where the light hit the room in a way that made everything briefly, inexplicably right. Hold that moment. Now notice what just happened in your chest. Not just warmth, something else underneath it, something tighter. A flicker you almost didn't catch. That flicker is the second layer. The teaching the Buddha called it viparinama dukkha, the suffering of change. And it is, I think, the most emotionally precise teaching in the entire Pali Canon. Here is the core of it, from a dialogue in the Majjhima Nikaya. A bhikkhun named Dhammadinna, one of the most brilliant minds in the early Buddhist community, was asked about the nature of feeling, and she said this: "Pleasant feeling is pleasant in remaining, and painful in changing." MN 44. Read that again. Pleasant feeling is pleasant in remaining, and painful in changing. Not, pleasure is bad. Not, you shouldn't enjoy things. Not, joy is an illusion. The Buddha, through Dhammadinna, whose analysis he later endorsed without changing a word, is saying something far more surgical than that. He's saying, joy and grief are not opposites. They are two properties of the same experience. The joy is real and built into its structure, not as a flaw, not as a punishment, but as a feature of how conditioned things work, is the fact that it will change. And when it changes, the joy doesn't simply stop. It inverts. What was pleasant becomes the precise instrument of pain. That's not pessimism. That's anatomy. The knife. Think about what this actually means in a life. You raise a child, 20 years of presents, breakfast tables, car rides, homework at the kitchen counter, the ordinary days you barely noticed while they were happening. Then one day the house is quiet, and you realize the quiet is going to last. The joy of those 20 years has not disappeared. It has become the exact shape of the absence. The deeper the love, the more precise the cut. Or a career, 40 years of identity. I am the person who does this. And then retirement, or a layoff, or just the slow realization that the world has moved on. The satisfaction of those decades doesn't vanish. It curdles. It becomes the measuring stick against which every empty Tuesday is judged. This is what the Buddha saw. Not that pleasure leads to pain. That's obvious. Any philosopher can tell you good times end. The insight is sharper. The pleasure itself becomes the pain. They are not sequential. They are structural. The knife was in the hand the moment you picked up the gift. Why this hits differently at 55. I want to be direct about something. If you're watching this and you're 25, this teaching is interesting. If you're watching this and you're 55 or 65, this teaching is autobiographical. Because by now, you have the data. You know what it feels like to hold a photograph from 30 years ago and feel the joy and the grief simultaneously. Not one after the other, but fused, two edges of the same blade. You know what it's like to visit a place that was once filled with people who are no longer alive, and to feel the beauty of the memory and the ache of the absence as a single experience. The Buddha didn't discover this. You already know it. What he did was name the mechanism. He said, "This is not a bug. This is not bad luck. This is not God testing you. This is how conditioned things work. Anything that arises on conditions will change when those conditions change. And your response to that change, your resistance to it, your clinging to what was, is not a separate event. It is part of the original experience." That's what the second layer diagnoses. not pain, not loss, the structure of impermanence embedded in every pleasant moment you will ever have. The doctor's precision. And notice what the doctor is doing here. He isn't saying, stop enjoying things. That's the Stoic move. Reduce attachment by reducing investment. The Buddha's prescription, when we get to it, is entirely different. He isn't asking you to feel less. He's asking you to see clearly what you're already feeling. There's a sutta, the Magandhya Sutta, where the Buddha describes a man covered in open sores who sits near a fire pit for relief. The heat on his wounds feels like comfort. But, the Buddha says, the more he would burn and be seared, the more he would experience that as pleasant, to the extent that it was actually painful to the touch. N 75. The disease has distorted what the word pleasant even means. That's not cruelty. That's the most compassionate thing a doctor can say. Your perception of what feels good is not currently reliable. And until you understand that, every treatment I offer will be misunderstood. Let me stop and say something clearly, because the second layer is where most people decide Buddhism is depressing. It isn't. And here's the test. Is a doctor cruel for telling you that the numbness in your hand is not just sleeping, that it's a nerve signal you need to pay attention to? Or is the cruelty in the reassurance, in the friend who says, I'm sure it's nothing, because the truth is uncomfortable? The Buddha is not the friend who says, I'm sure it's nothing. The Buddha is the doctor who respects you enough to say what he sees. The diagnosis is precise because there is a treatment. You don't map a disease this carefully unless you intend to cure it. But before the cure, there's one more layer, the deepest one. The one that goes past pain, past loss, past anything you can point to and say, that's the problem, didn't. The third layer is the one where the Buddha says, even when nothing is wrong, even when pleasure is present and loss is absent and life is, by any ordinary standard, fine, there is still a wobble at the center of the wheel. And that's where Buddhism steps into territory no other system of thought has ever mapped. Layer 3, the deepest cut. The quiet room. Imagine a day where nothing goes wrong. No pain, no loss, no bad news. You wake up rested. The weather cooperates. No one you love is sick. No deadline looms. The afternoon stretches out in front of you with nowhere to be and nothing to fix. And still, underneath all of it, there's a hum. A restlessness you can't quite locate. Not anxiety, exactly. Not boredom, exactly. Something subtler. A sense that you should be doing something, or wanting something, or getting somewhere. Even though, right now, by every measure that matters, you're fine. You felt this. Everyone has. Most people never name it. They reach for their phone, or open the fridge, or turn on the television. Not because they want anything in particular, but because sitting with that hum is, for reasons they can't articulate, uncomfortable. The Buddha named it, and what he said about it is, I believe, the single most radical diagnostic claim in the history of human thought. The teaching. He called it sankhara dukkha, the suffering inherent in anything that is conditioned. Anything that has been put together by causes and conditions, anything that depends on other things for its existence, carries this quality. Not because it's painful, not because it will change. That was the second layer. But because the very fact of being conditioned means it cannot fully satisfy. There's a verse in the Dhammapada that puts it in 5 words. Sabbe sankhara dukkha. All conditioned things are dukkha. DP 278. All of them, not just the painful ones. not just the pleasant ones that will eventually change. All fabricated experience, including the moments you would describe as perfectly neutral, perfectly fine, perfectly okay, carries this wobble. And that's where Buddhism steps off the map that every other tradition has drawn. What makes this different? Christianity has an answer for pain, redemption, the cross, suffering as meaningful sacrifice. Stoicism has an answer for loss. Accept what you cannot control. Existentialism has an answer for meaninglessness. Create your own meaning in an indifferent universe. Psychotherapy has an answer for distress. Understand it, process it, integrate it. But none of them, not one, addresses the quiet room, the afternoon where nothing is wrong and something is still off. Because every other system assumes that if you remove the pain and manage the loss and find the meaning, you arrive at a state that is genuinely, fully satisfactory. The project is complete. The wheel spins true. The Buddha said, no. The wheel has a structural problem, not in its worst moments, not in its transitions, in its engineering. The axle hole, remember the axle hole, is off-center by design, not because a god made it badly, not because you did something wrong, because anything assembled from conditions inherits the instability of those conditions. Conditioned satisfaction is real, but it is never complete. There is always a gap between what experience delivers and what the mind reaches for. That gap is sankhara dukkha, and only Buddhism diagnosed it. The honest footnote. Now, if you've read about the 3 layers of dukkha in a book or heard them in a talk, there's a good chance they were presented as part of the first sermon. The Buddha sits in the deer park, delivers the 4 noble truths, and lays out 3 layers of suffering. That's not quite what happened. The 3 layers do appear in the Pali Canon, in the Dukkha Sutta, a short text where the Buddha names them directly: the suffering of change, the suffering of conditioned existence, SN 45.165. Sariputta, the Buddha's chief disciple in wisdom, explains the same framework to a wanderer in another sutta, SN 38.14, but neither of these is the first sermon. The Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Deer Park Discourse, names dukkha and lists its manifestations, but does not present this threefold classification. The systematic elaboration, with each layer mapped to a type of feeling, each one neatly distinguished, was crystallized centuries later by the commentator Buddhaghosa in the Visuddhimagga, a monumental 5th century work that became the standard lens through which most of the world reads Theravada Buddhism. Buddhaghosa also reversed the canonical order. In the suttas, the sequence runs: the suffering of conditioned existence, then the suffering of change. Buddhaghosa flipped the last 2, putting change before conditioned existence, and that reordering became the modern standard. It's the order I've followed in this video, because the ascending arc makes the teaching easier to grasp on first encounter. But you should know, the original sequence was different, and scholars still debate whether Buddhaghosa's reshuffling changed not just the order, but the emphasis. Why does this matter? Because intellectual honesty is part of the diagnosis. The Buddha's teaching is powerful enough to survive being quoted accurately. It doesn't need embellishment, and it doesn't need the neat packaging of a later commentator to be presented as the original. When this channel cites a sutta, it's a sutta. When it's commentary, I'll tell you what the 3rd layer means for you. So Miran, 3 layers, pain you can name, joy that carries its own ending, and underneath both, a fundamental incompleteness that persists even when nothing is wrong. If you hear that and feel a kind of recognition, not despair, but recognition, the way you feel when someone finally says the thing you've been sensing for years but couldn't articulate, then you're hearing the diagnosis the way it was meant to be heard. Because the Buddha was not trying to make you sad. He was trying to make you accurate, to see experience as it actually operates, before your preferences and narratives smooth it over into something more comfortable. And here's what matters most. He did this for a reason. This is not philosophy. This is not a theory about the nature of the universe offered for intellectual consideration. This is the first step of a medical protocol. You map the disease precisely because the treatment depends on precision. A vague diagnosis gets you a vague cure. A precise diagnosis, 3 layers deep, from the obvious to the radical, gets you something that might actually work. And now that the diagnosis is on the table, all 3 layers, nothing softened, nothing inflated, we can ask, how did the Buddha actually deliver it? Because the setting matters, the audience matters, and what happened in that room 25 centuries ago will reframe everything you've just heard. The first consultation. The room here is what we know. It is a deer park near the city of Varanasi, a place called Isipatana. The Buddha has been awake, fully, irreversibly awake, for several weeks, and he has walked a long way to find 5 specific men. These 5 were monks, ascetics. They had practiced alongside him for years during his most extreme phase, starving, barely sleeping, pushing the body to its edge in search of liberation. And when the Buddha abandoned that path, when he accepted a meal, sat beneath a tree, and found awakening through a middle way that looked, to them, like giving up, they left. They made a pact. If he comes, we don't stand. We don't greet him. We don't show respect. He quit. He came anyway. And according to the text, they couldn't hold the pact. Something in his presence, the suttas don't explain what, only that it happened, dissolved their resolve. One took his bowl, another prepared a seat. They called him friend, which was too informal, and he corrected them, not out of ego, but because what he was about to say required them to listen differently than they had ever listened before. SN 56.11. The middle way first, and then he did something pedagogically remarkable. He did not start with a diagnosis. He started with an objection. These 5 men were extreme ascetics. They believed liberation came through self-mortification, through pain so total that the body could no longer distract the mind, and the man sitting in front of them had rejected that method. So before he could teach them anything, he had to disarm the objection they were already holding. He described 2 dead ends: sensual indulgence, which he called low, coarse, the way of ordinary people, unprofitable, and self-mortification, which he called painful, ignoble, unprofitable. Then he named the road between them, the middle way, and he defined it not as a vague compromise, but as a specific path, the Noble Eightfold Path. 8 practices from right understanding to right concentration, SN 56.11. The treatment before the diagnosis. The cure laid on the table before the disease was even named. That's not the order you'd expect, but for this audience, 5 men whose entire identity was built on the method he was about to dismantle. It was the only order that would work. He gave them somewhere to stand before he pulled the ground out from under them. The doctor doesn't walk into a room of frightened patients and open with the worst news. He says, "There is a treatment. Now let me tell you what we're treating." 4 truths, 3 turnings. Then came the 4 noble truths. and the way the Buddha presented them is unlike anything in the history of religion or philosophy. He didn't present them once, he turned them 3 times. The first turning was recognition. This is dukkha. This is the origin of dukkha. This is the cessation of dukkha. This is the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. Statement. Identification. The doctor naming what he sees. The second turning was task, and this is the one that changes everything. Dukkha is to be comprehended, not believed, not accepted, not suffered through with grace. Comprehended, the way you comprehend how an engine works by taking it apart. Each truth carried its own task. Dukkha is to be comprehended. Its origin, craving, is to be abandoned. Its cessation is to be realized. The path is to be developed. S, N, and 56.11. 4 truths, 4 tasks, not a creed, a protocol. This is what the scholar monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu has spent decades emphasizing. The 4 noble truths are not propositions about reality that you're asked to accept on faith. They're categories of experience, each one paired with a specific action. You don't believe in dukkha the way you believe the earth is round. You comprehend it directly in your own experience, the way a doctor comprehends a disease by examining it firsthand. The third turning was verification. Dukkha has been comprehended. Its origin has been abandoned. Its cessation has been realized. The path has been developed. Past tense, done. The Buddha said he claimed full awakening only when all 12 aspects, 4 truths times 3 turnings, were, in his words, truly pure. Intellectual understanding alone was not enough. Knowing what dukkha is not the same as comprehending it. SN 56.11. Kondanya. And then something happened that the text treats as the hinge of history. One of the 5 monks, Kondanya, the eldest, understood. Not the words, the principle underneath the words. The text says his insight was this: whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. Not a restatement of the 4 truths. Something beneath them, the underlying grammar. Anything that begins will end. Any process that starts can stop, including suffering, including the clinging that drives it. And the Buddha, who had just delivered the most carefully structured teaching in the Pali Canon, responded with something almost childlike in its directness. So you really know, Kondanya. You really know. SN 56.11. That's not a teacher grading a student. That's a doctor watching the patient understand, for the first time, what the diagnosis means, not as information, but as something felt in the body. The difference between being told you have a condition and the moment you actually comprehend what that means for your life. That difference between knowing and comprehending is the entire architecture of the 3 turnings, and it is the reason the Buddha delivered the diagnosis we've spent this video unpacking. Not so you would know that experience wobbles, so you would see it directly in your own life, until knowing becomes comprehending, and comprehending becomes the first movement toward freedom. The wheel had been set in motion. The Dhammacakkappavattana, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma. 1 monk understood. 4 more would follow. But we need to step back now and ask the question that the entire diagnosis has been building toward. If this is the disease, all 3 layers, mapped with this precision, then what does it mean that the doctor says it can end? The doctor's real message. We've spent this entire video inside the diagnosis. 3 layers, each one deeper, each one more precise, each one harder to dismiss. Pain you can name, joy that carries its own knife, and underneath both, a wobble that persists even when everything is fine. If the Buddha had stopped there, Buddhism would be exactly what the Victorians called it: a religion of despair, a philosophy that stares at the wound and offers nothing but a detailed description of how deep it goes. He didn't stop there. Noble Truth 3. The third noble truth, the one that rarely makes headlines, the one that life is suffering has buried for a century and a half, is the most radical statement in the diagnosis. It says cessation is possible, not management, not coping, not learning to live with it. Cessation, the complete, remainderless fading and ending of the craving that drives the wobble. In the first sermon, the remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. SN 56.11. Read that list. Every word is an action: fading, cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, letting go. 6 ways of saying, this can stop, and you are the one who stops it. No intermediary, no grace from above, no waiting for the universe to rearrange itself in your favor. The third noble truth says, the disease that this entire video has been diagnosing, you can end it. Not after death, not in another life, in this one. Thanisaro Bhikkhu puts the point as directly as anyone ever has. If life was suffering, he writes, where would we look for an end to suffering? We'd be left with nothing but death and annihilation. But when the actual truth is that clinging is suffering, we simply have to look for the clinging and eliminate its causes. That's the turn. That's what the mistranslation destroyed. Life is suffering is a closed door. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. There is dukkha, and it can end, is an open one. The most open door in the history of religion, the handful of leaves. And the Buddha knew exactly what he was doing. There's a moment, later in his teaching life, in a forest called Sasapavana, where he picked up a handful of leaves and asked his monks, which is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in this forest? The forest, of course. In the same way, he said, the things I have directly known but have not taught you are far more than what I have taught. SN 56.31. Then he told them why. He hadn't taught the rest because it wasn't useful. It didn't lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to peace. He taught only what served the diagnosis and the cure. Not everything that was true, only what was useful for freedom. That's not a philosopher. That's a doctor. A doctor doesn't tell you every fact about cellular biology when you're sitting in his office. He tells you what you need to know to get well. The rest, the vast forest of things the Buddha knew but didn't teach, can wait. The diagnosis we've walked through today, dukkha, 3 layers deep, is a handful of leaves, chosen not because it's the only thing worth knowing, but because it's the thing you need to know first. Close. So here's where we stand. The doctor has walked into the room. He's described the condition with a precision that no one before him, and, in this particular way, no one after him has matched. 3 layers. From the obvious to the invisible. From the pain everyone already knows to the wobble that only silence can reveal. And his message, the part that 150 years of mistranslation tried to bury, is not, you are doomed. It is, you have a condition. I have mapped it. It can end. And here is the path. We've covered the diagnosis, the first noble truth. What dukkha actually is in its full depth. But a diagnosis only explains what. It doesn't explain why. What drives the wobble? What keeps the wheel turning on a broken axle? The Buddha had a word for that. Tanha, craving. And what modern science has discovered about the mechanisms of wanting maps onto that ancient word, in ways that neither tradition expected. That's another conversation. For now, sit with the diagnosis, not as a verdict, as a beginning.